90 to 92. The Gerry Ryan Show, Monday to Friday, 9 till 12 on 2FM.
Question. What do you think of prostitution? When I say that word to you, what comes to mind? The exchange of sex for money or not? Perhaps you picture curb crawlers, stag parties, trips to Amsterdam. Of course, it's regulated there, isn't it? Surely it's safe. Surely that's the best argument in the world for legalising and decriminalising prostitution. But how do you view the prostitutes themselves? Do you see them as someone to be pitied or as criminals who should be punished? The oldest trade in the world? Prostitution is a subject that is sensitive, controversial and has many myths attached to it. Such as that one, possibly. Is it, in fact, the oldest trade in the world? And even if it was, would that be an excuse for anything? The debate concerning policy varies from those who feel that legalising and decriminalising prostitution would be the sensible way to go, while the more conservative will argue that prostitution should be abolished completely. Roger Matthews is Professor of Criminology at London's South Bank University and has carried out extensive research in the area of street prostitution. He joins us from the BBC studios in London to discuss his findings, which he has placed in his book Prostitution, Politics and Policy. Professor Matthews, good morning and welcome.
Good morning.
Good to have you with us. First of all, you have focused exclusively, though I gather you're not without your opinions about brothels and off-street prostitution. Why did you only focus on prostitution on the street?
Well, the book focuses mainly on street prostitution because that's really where most of the work and most of the research has been done. Mm-hmm. And also it's where the policy debate has been for the last 10 years. So really in terms of policy, the main focus has been around street prostitution.
Now, the murders in Ipswich brought prostitution under intense scrutiny by the media and by, indeed, the authorities recently, and also forced us to challenge some of the ideas that we've developed, some of them vicariously, some of them based on research, some of them based on nothing but instinct. For instance, it's the oldest profession in the world. Look at Amsterdam. They have health checks there, they have welfare, they pay tax, it's upfront, it's safer, it's better that way. And yet, of course, we 5 female Ipswich prostitutes murdered, and their murder carried out by truck driver Steve Wright. Now, this made people stop and think.
Well, I think in many ways the Ipswich situation was a turning point in this whole debate, not least of which the nature of 5 murders in a short period of time in one location was very, very dramatic and very disturbing. But I think there were a couple of things to do with that as well that were quite important. I mean, one was that one of the girls, Paula Clennell, was actually interviewed on television after I think 2 girls had already been murdered. And then she herself was murdered 3 or 4 days later. And basically, it was quite clear that the service in Ipswich could not provide the safety and security for these women. And ultimately, when she got murdered a few days later, it really raised big questions in my mind, I think in the mind of lots of people, about how dangerous this actual work is. And I think once you start looking at street prostitution, you realise that actually it's probably one of the most dangerous professions in the world. And that
she was a drug addict. She was doing it basically to feed her drug habit.
Well, I think this is the other important thing. I think, certainly in England and Wales now, is that in most areas up and down the country, somewhere between 70 and 90% of women who work on the streets are problematic drug users, using heroin, crack cocaine, and this is actually what is driving the prostitution. And in many ways, the old type of street prostitutes, who just used to go out to earn a few quid to, basically pay the gas bill or, get out of financial difficulty, have actually largely disappeared from the streets, and what we're left with now is a group of women who are very drug addicted, very disorganised, problematic women, and basically the whole composition of the women working on the street has actually changed very dramatically.
Now, Liberals will turn to the Amsterdam argument and say, well, OK, what you need to do is decriminalise it, make street prostitution completely illegal and have a zero tolerance of it, push everything into an orchestrated environment where you monitor the whole thing, where people have to be registered, where there are health checks, where there's a revenue audit and where there's tax paid and where there's a monitoring, possibly using something akin to a tourist police or something like that. And that will work, and that will be to the benefit of the prostitutes, the users, and society in general. You say no, that's bunkum.
Bunkum, yeah. It's not the word that I use, but I mean, I do discuss it at length in the book. I mean, mainly because, as you say, a lot of people think that legalization is the way forward.
It's a good argument. I mean, it sounds good. It dances. It does all the things it says on the tin.
Actually, it doesn't do it. The problem is it appears to. The initial view of it is it looks very attractive, and you think, well, as you say, people are paying tax. It's clean. It's organised. It's going to deal with the problem. In fact, actually, what's interesting about Amsterdam is that Amsterdam has been a complete failure on every conceivable level. In fact, actually, the number of brothels in Amsterdam they've actually closed down half of the brothels in Amsterdam in the last 3 or 4 years. It is a total disaster on every level. One is, people aren't paying taxes. 2, that organised crime has now moved into Amsterdam, and that's why the local authorities are closing the brothels down. The women are reporting that they're working 14, 16 hours a day for nothing. They're not getting any kind of protection. And basically the guys who run these brothels are mostly kind of maverick entrepreneurs who aren't interested in paying tax and haven't paid any tax. And basically, as the authorities have sort of moved in to try and get them to pay tax, is they've closed down the legal brothels, and now what's happened is there's been a massive expansion in illegal brothels. So basically on every front, I mean, whichever way you look at it in Amsterdam, if you ever want an example of the failure of legalisation, just look at Amsterdam. It is a complete disaster all round.
I know that the mayor of Amsterdam is on record very recently as saying that he is utterly sick of international sex tourists trying to prop up this particular economy, and that organised crime in particular seems to have the lion's share of the business, and that he for one would be happy to see the entire thing closed down, which of course runs completely contrary to the policy of local government back in the 60s when these changes were taking place. Now, are you saying that is this the failure of the Dutch authorities, or is this a profession which is beyond regulation?
The problem is as we were saying, on an immediate initial level, there's a certain attractiveness to this argument about cleanliness and about organisation and whatever. What people don't realise when they start talking about
and line of sight, I think that was the thing that I think most people hoped for, that you could see what was happening and therefore you would regulate it.
Yeah, it would be visible, it would be open, all those kinds of things, and the women would be looked after. All these things are very attractive arguments. The problem is that once you start getting into the murky business of the sex trade, is you realise, one is that the guys who are interested in running these kinds of establishments, if you want to make a living out of women selling their bodies, it normally attracts a certain range of entrepreneurs, the less scrupulous kinds. And basically, these guys are not interested in paying tax, they're not interested in running proper institutions. And basically most of them are actually increasingly linked with organised crime. And in fact, actually, I was in Amsterdam a couple of weeks ago, and they're actually now talking about getting even more stringent in Amsterdam and closing down even more brothels. So, I mean, basically, within a few years' time, there'll be, the whole red light district will be even smaller than it is now and more tightly regulated.
Well, what about the argument? It's at least the devil you know is better than the one you don't. As soon as you close down these brothels, they will go out of our line of sight. They'll drop below the radar, and God only knows what will be happening then.
Well, this is always the argument. The argument when people argued against street prostitution and said, "Look, let's try and close down street prostitution," everybody said, "Well, it'll go to the brothels."
Yeah.
But actually, it doesn't. I mean, the women who work on the street, for example, would never get employed in brothels because they're too disorganised, they're too drug-ridden to work in brothels. Also, when women come out of brothels, I mean, where else do they go? I mean, escort trade, working from flats. I mean, there is no evidence that suggests that if you close down brothels, that women actually move elsewhere. And it was always the argument against street prostitution that if you closed it down, that somehow or other this would prop up the off-street trade, which was a total myth. I mean, it never happened, and it will never happen. But the other argument about it, it's interesting how people use this displacement argument in terms of prostitution, because if you think about things like dealing with things like, say, violence or burglary or any other kind of situation, people don't say, well, if we have a crackdown on burglary, aren't all these burglars going to turn to shoplifting? I mean, why would one make that assumption? If you close down brothels and these places aren't operating, these women are going to find something else to do, and it may not be something illegal. It may be something more constructive.
But is there any evidence to show that has ever happened?
No one's done the work. I mean, this is why the whole area is just sort of shrouded in all these kind of myths and misconceptions. I mean, we've done work that's looked at street prostitution and off-street prostitution, and we've quashed the myth that said that if you reduce street prostitution, that the off-street trade would grow. We managed to kill that during the 1990s. Eventually, there were still people still arguing that, but I mean, the argument's largely been quashed, and really what we need is some research that says, what do women do when they leave working in brothels? Do they move on somewhere in the sex trade? My suspicion is that a lot of them, go out and do other things that are actually more useful.
Okay, well, let's go back maybe to the heart of the matter without bringing philosophy into it, but at the risk of doing that. I think we all know that, and we sense by instinct that, and certainly society since the cave has legislated against somebody coming into your home, for instance, and killing you or stealing your possessions or trespassing upon your property. So we know that that's wrong and it's never going to be right. We modify it a little if it appears maybe that the person was invited in or whatever. But basically we know that taking stuff from other people, for instance, is wrong, and we've laws to punish people or dissuade them from doing that. Do you believe that the act of paying for sex is in itself wrong?
I think the problem about paying for sex is again, a question about whether you want to get into serious philosophy of this or not. I mean, probably it's the wrong time and wrong place to get to
well, indulge me.
Okay. Well, look, the first thing that one has to say about this is that, I mean, one of the big philosophical arguments in all of this is that basically that it's just another form of work and it doesn't do women any harm, and that basically if they can sleep with 10 clients a day, they can have a shower at the end of the day, go home, feed the kids, make love to their husband, and the world is all right.
It's better than working in a sweatshop, etc., etc., etc.
Exactly. But of course, a quick scrutiny at all this, actually, again, a bit like the legalization argument, shows that actually that it's erroneous. What we know from all the women we've interviewed, is that basically you cannot disassociate having sex with 8, 10 or 20 men a day from your own sense of identity. And that basically most of the women that get involved in prostitution over a period of time find themselves, can only sustain this life by basically drugging themselves up. They lose contact with their children, they lose contact with their families, they lose their self-respect, they change their identity, and basically, in one sense, most of these women that get involved in prostitution are damaged in the process. They do not come out the same as they went in. And basically, there is a philosophical argument which basically says, how much damage do you allow people to do to themselves before you intervene?
And of course, that has always been a huge challenge to any democratic or open or free society, hasn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's like smoking or drinking or people who want to commit suicide. The question is, at what point in people's lives when you can see that they're damaging themselves? And again, going back to the Ipswich thing, what was interesting about Ipswich is that why it resonated, is that every prostitute that I've ever interviewed has had a life-threatening experience. Not just, people getting rough with them, but people who've held knives to their throats, guns to their heads. And basically, it's more dangerous than being a stuntman. There is no job in the world that's actually more dangerous. And actually, what's coming out from the research is that whereas people actually thought that women who worked indoors were a bit safer, what you're actually finding now is actually more dangerous, because a lot of these women who work indoors are kind of trapped in that situation with somebody. So if you've got someone who's actually dangerous or whatever, your chances of getting out of the situation are much more remote. What happens when you interview the girls who walk on the streets is they'll tell you, that they kick the guys, they run away from them, they jump out of cars, they do all these kinds of things. If you're stuck in a brothel with some psychopath, I mean, you are there and you have got to deal with it, and it's a lot more difficult to deal with it in that situation than it is to deal with it on the street.
Okay, well, let's look at the user's point of view and see if there's anything to be learned from that. it would seem, according to what the book says, is that a huge number of men at some stage in their lives would have paid for sex, like 75%.
Yeah.
Which is phenomenal. Now, this indicates to me that sex, surprise, 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 is a very powerful force. Of course, men and women differ in the way that they view sex, not as much maybe as we'd like to think, but they do differ. Men want to satisfy their sexual needs. It's a non-victim crime. Guys are just looking for something different. This is never going to change. That's another one of the arguments.
Sure, and another one of the myths. I mean, what's interesting? I mean, one of the myths is that the men who go to prostitutes are the desperate, the lonely, the disabled or whatever. I mean, this is a kind of liberal myth around these notions. I mean, what you find is when you go and interview these guys, is that most of them have partners. I mean, work we did, for example, with curb crawlers. When they do police reports, when they first apprehend curb crawlers, the first statement that something like 80% of curb crawlers actually made when we did some research was, "Please don't tell my wife." This is not about desperate, lonely men. This is about men who basically take advantage of a situation that happens to be there. And the other research that it's been conducted by looking at demand is that basically although a lot of men have actually visited prostitutes, is a lot of them only actually go there occasionally, and very often it's a sort of boys' night out.
Yeah.
And at the end of the boys' night out, they've had a few pints, and somebody says, "Look, I've got a couple of £100. Why don't we go down to the local brothel and have some fun?" And basically, if it wasn't there, they'd go dancing or something. They'd go and do something else. But it's a kind of it's an entertainment. It's on tap. You can pay for it. It's a bit of a
So which is the more target-rich environment then? The prostitutes are the guys who are using it, because it would seem that it doesn't really matter which one you take out, but if one of them is gone, the other doesn't rely on it.
Absolutely, and what we've just done some research actually, just literally a month or so back, and what that research shows is that anything pretty well that problematises the purchase of sex will actually put most punters off. I mean, i.e., the level of motivation is very shallow. I mean, these are not desperate men who've got some massive sex urge they've got to satisfy. They, this is about entertainment. It's about a bit of variation, whatever. I mean, basically, if there was something better on TV, most of these guys wouldn't bother.
So, in answer to the question, where should we aim the attack? Should it be on the prostitutes, or should it be on the users?
Well, the argument in the book is quite clear. I mean, basically, what we have to do is to problematise the purchase of sex for customers, which is already beginning, which is basically, particularly in terms of, women who are trafficked, underage women who are coerced on one level, so that, that people actually buying sex, find it a more problematic experience, which all the evidence suggests that's going to put a lot of them off. And basically, we need to provide welfare and support for most of these women that are actually involved in the trade, because most of them, particularly women who work on the street, are the most, problematic people, who have not only have problems of drug use, but problems of housing and problems of health and problems of mental health. We're talking about a very, very unfortunate group of women who really need a lot of help and a lot of support. And what's interesting, actually, post-Ipswich, is that Ipswich has taken the very significant radical strategy of trying to eradicate street prostitution in Ipswich. Mm-hmm. And because they've actually got targeted support at the women, they've reduced the number of women working in Ipswich from 30 down to 3 in less than a year. I mean, I think that's a major achievement, and one that, people around the country ought to be emulating. Now,
in relation, though, to the guys who use prostitutes, I mean, there's been a tendency, and it's not just a tendency, in fact, there's a pattern over the last 30 years. While curb crawling is something that can bring you to court, the likelihood of you ending up in court does not seem to be huge. The level of prosecution isn't huge, certainly isn't in this country. And the penalties are not huge. And they don't seem to differentiate between, if you use the car analogy, between smashing a headlight on a car and grand auto theft. In the United States, you steal somebody's car, it's the equivalent of stealing 50 grand from them. Here in Ireland, you steal somebody's car and you're accused of driving without permission. It's entirely different. One is a very serious crime, one is the other is not. We have not in this society, and this is the one that I'm familiar with, obviously most in terms of the way that we view the user, we have not criminalised or stigmatised the user to any great degree, despite the changes on the books.
But I mean, basically, I think the debate is beginning to take off here in terms of addressing demand, and I think what's beginning to happen is people are beginning to realise that actually, this is not a non-problematic process, and that even on one level, even if you accept the male right to purchase sex from a woman, if you accept that, which in itself is a problematic notion, but what we know is a lot of these women who work in brothels are either trafficked, they're underage, they're coerced, they're drugged to actually be there, and basically, I think that it's about time we started thinking about situations where women are working in these places under some degree of coercion.
So in other words, you're saying what we should really be thinking of is accessorising the user. So when there's a raid on a brothel, or when you're picked up using a prostitute on the canal bank, who you've picked up off the street, rather than just the simple curb crawling or having sex in public, having paid for type of scenario unfolding and the subsequent prosecution, that for instance, if it's somebody who's in sexual bondage or slavery, an underage person or somebody who's had their passport taken away from it, that you in fact become an accessory to that crime. Is that what you're suggesting?
And you prosecute them, and you prosecute them hard. And basically, what's very interesting, if you watch on the television, I mean, I don't know whether you have these kind of scenes in Ireland, but you see them in England and Wales occasionally, where they have the thing called Operation Pentameter, which is the police raiding on brothels and pulling out trafficked women. What's always interesting about those scenes when on the 6 o'clock news is you see the women coming out the front door of the brothel, very often with towels or something over their heads to hide their identity. But you never see any men. I mean, where do all the men go?
Out the back door.
Out the back door, exactly. And basically, one's has to raise questions about how it's being policed and why aren't the police.
Well, you know that's a policy that's spoken about. You know that usually the local inspector, and not without some connivance probably from more senior authorities, has said, look, we're not really interested in the Joes, we want the Janes.
Exactly. Well, basically, I think it's about time that we call them to account and we ask them what happens to these punters. Why aren't they being prosecuted for having sex with women who've been coerced into prostitution? I mean, basically, these women are slaves. I mean, you've actually got women in a situation of slavery, and men are using them. I think men in those situations have a culpability and ought to be brought to account.
It's a huge challenge, though, that you're presented with, because
it's not huge at all, Gerry. It's very simple.
You addressed it in the book, though, as this double standards issue, where prostitutes are promiscuous and men are just exercising their fundamental right to vary their sexual experience.
But it's not about rights in that sense. I mean, basically, this is very easy to police. If you and I want to do it, I mean, let me give you another point in this direction, right? Is that basically it's illegal in this country to run an institution, a brothel that actually employs more than two people. In every high street in the UK, or every high street in England anyway, is that there is now a brothel. Every child over the age of 12 knows that these are brothels. They call them massage parlours, they call them saunas, but we all know that they're brothels. Now, if 12-year-olds can actually identify them as brothels, why do the police have such a job actually trying to work out where they are?
Well, why?
Exactly. Well, why? Exactly. The question is why, isn't it? The question is, why don't they want to know? What the police will tell you is that dealing with prostitution.
You're suggesting that there's a sort of patriarchal boys' club mentality in that.
There is no doubt part of that, but also the other thing, and more maybe strategically, is that the police, when I've asked the police about this, they tell me that that this is not a policing priority. It's not one of their targets. Therefore, this is not something that they're actually going to put time and resources into. I mean, maybe we should be arguing that it ought to be one of their targets, and they ought to be given the resources and the pressure to actually deal with this in a proper way.
Yeah, and of course you do identify the Ipswich example is a perfect example of when the police sit up and take notice, and that's when the profile, their level of involvement, their profile becomes a thing of scrutiny, and then of course you do see a reaction, because nobody wants to be associated with the death of anybody, regardless of what prejudiced public opinion may be in relation to somebody who's disorganised, disenfranchised, living on the margins, or indeed a drug addict. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. Don't go away. Back in a moment.
Afternoons on 2FM, kicking off at midday with Nikki Hayes and her all-request lunch. That's 120 minutes of your music. You choose, we obey, and play. Be in with a chance of winning the biggest prizes on radio. Then at 2 p.m., Ricochet perks up your day with a box full of afternoon delights. Interviews from the biggest stars and bizarre topics to keep your brain in motion. Afternoons on 2FM. You work, we play.
Welcome back in our studio in the BBC in London. We have Roger Matthews, Professor of Criminology in London's South Bank University, and also the author of Prostitution, Politics and Policy. Roger, we've been examining which side of this story is probably the more valuable to concentrate on. It would seem that both sides, obviously, is probably the way to go about it. When we look at, we should also examine, though, and you do this in the book, the the entry mechanisms into prostitution. And of course, society is changing at an ever accelerating velocity, and we have lots more reasons now why women would end up in prostitution, and why society seems not to be as negative about it, and also why more men than ever before, maybe from different backgrounds where they might have been prevented by education or prejudice even from using prostitutes. It seems that more and more fellas who consider themselves reasonably decent, ordinary chaps would now consider it. And there's a hugely different dynamic than there was, say, 50 or 60 years ago, isn't there?
Yeah, I think it's changed. I still think it's the case amongst most men. I don't know about, certainly my generation and maybe your generation too. Yeah. But, I still think there was still a very large stigmatization about paying for sex. I think the general view amongst most men is that basically it's a little bit sad if you actually got to go out and pay for it. I mean, if you can't actually go out and meet somebody and develop a relationship.
But I think most fellas that will pay for it, if they think that they won't get caught, and if they think it's going to be easy, going back to one of your earlier points.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, the figure you quoted earlier on about the number of percentage of men, isn't that's a wrong figure. You need to talk to your research people. The number of men who actually use prostitutes is actually relatively small. It's certainly less than 10%. It's probably more like 5%. But anyway, it might be 7.5%. Maybe the dot's missing from 7.5. But anyway, the point about it is, I still think there's still a very large taboo amongst men, and it's seen as being a kind of a failure on your part if you can't actually go out and get a girlfriend and have a proper relationship, and you end up by paying for sex. I think it's a bit it's a bit sad, really, and I still think that ethos remains. And although there's a kind of there is a kind of an element of people, I think, on kind of boys' nights out and whatever. This is a kind of a new form of entertainment. I still think that a lot of men that we've spoken to, that we've done interviews with, who've actually had paid for sex on a boys' night out, have actually felt very unhappy about it, really, and they've kind of gone along with the crowd. But it's not something that they would actually feel they'd want to brag about.
I suppose maybe I'm referring in part also, though, to the blurring of the lines that takes place now, where you have maybe lap dancing clubs are clubs where there's a highly charged sexual atmosphere or dimension, and this is being sold as part of the plot. Does this affect, do you believe, the way that guys will consider whether or not they're going to pay for sex or seek to pay for sex or not? Yeah.
Well, I think it does. I mean, there is no doubt that, what we've seen has been a massive expansion of the commercialised sex industry, and obviously, it's a big money earner. I was talking to a guy in a pub in London recently who's just brought in lap dancing. He basically said, it was the best earner he'd actually had. It's bringing in lots of money, lot of punters. There has been this development. I think, as you say, it's part of the commercialisation of the whole leisure industry. which is a kind of a bigger issue, but an important issue.
In terms of the women on the street, they're not there just of their own volition. There is another set of circumstances surrounding them. They may be young women who are at risk, who have a natural predisposition as a result of that. We've talked about the drugs issue already, but also there's a middleman. There's a middleman in every business, of course, and these guys have been there since the beginning of the whole business of exchanging money for sex, and continue to be there. Pimps. Obviously, this is another area that needs to be targeted as well. And what is the evidence that it's targeted at all?
Well, I think the whole thing about Pimps has been very low profile. I mean, what's distressing about this is the number of prosecution for Pimps has actually been going down. We know that a lot of these women are groomed. We know that in lots of these cases, that particularly when they're young, that somebody plays a significant role in actually getting them started in prostitution. Basically, again, that partly goes back to these issues about policing. There's obviously big issues about evidence and pimping, but one suspects that a lot more could be done to identify and prosecute and deal with people who are making a living out of actually putting other people into the sex trade.
Can you give us any comparisons in terms of, and always it goes back to the girls themselves, I mean, for each woman that's prosecuted for applying her trade on the street, I mean, how many pimps get prosecuted?
Very, very small percentage, and it is a big issue now. I mean, earlier on you made some reference to exiting.
Yeah.
One of the issues that's coming out with that now, of course, is that some of the exiting groups that are trying to help women get out of prostitution.
Does that work?
It does work, and it's been a very big development in the last few years, and it's an important development because, again, the kind of limited research that's available suggests that a large percentage of women would really like to get out, but feel trapped in prostitution because of the drugs, because of the homelessness, because of all these kind of problems. But actually, a lot of them, given the opportunity, would like to get out, and a lot of very good organisations have established themselves in the last 5 years or so to help these women out, and a lot of them are doing a lot of great work and helping these women rebuild their lives, which is not an easy thing to do. And when you see these women and you talk to them and you see their lives turning around, and they regain relationships with their children and their families, and put themselves back into some reasonable form of social life, it's enormously positive and really, really good to see. In cases where I've seen where women have turned around, it's been great. And you've seen women who basically prostitution in a way is a kind of form of social death. That's what people don't realise. If you operate in this world, is that basically you become very isolated. You don't have friends. I mean, even that awful program that was on the TV with I don't know whether you got it in Ireland on the Call Girl program. That was on the Billy Piper thing. Did you get that?
Oh, yes, indeed. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, what was interesting about that? The only thing that they
very attractive stocking and suspender-clad Billy Piper.
Exactly. But what they brought out in that, which was interesting, was she had no friends. Yeah. She had, there was nobody around her. I mean, you're on your own, and if you living your life in that kind of way, besides all the drugs and the housing and all the other problems, is a nightmare. And a lot of these women who want to leave, and a lot of them do. There are a lot of good organisations that are setting up now to actually help them get out, and they're doing great work, and they ought to be given maximum support to actually help these women.
Finally, would you agree that it is the one thing I think that everybody agrees on, that if there was some other job that you could do where you had where you were allowed the protection of some agency to exit so that you wouldn't be followed, because that often happens, they're followed back into normal society, where you would be given support to get off the drugs and deal with any welfare issues or problems or family or housing problems that you had, I think most women would take the opportunity, if they could get an equivalent or better salary, would take the opportunity to get out.
Yeah, but the salary thing is another myth, right? I mean,
we all need money.
Yeah, I know we do. We need money, but the point about it is, if you go and talk to these women who work on the street, I mean, they're always broke. I mean, they never got any money. I mean, they earn it and burn it. I mean, these not people who are earning money like you and I might think, oh, I'll take out a mortgage or I'll go and make a little investment in Northern Rock or whatever. I mean, basically, these people are broke, perennially broke. The money's been taken by everyone around them. They're surrounded by parasites. They're surrounded by people, and also most of them are heavy drug users. Even the women who work indoors, who might not be taking heroin and crack cocaine. A lot of them are living on amphetamine, they're living on tranks, they're living on all sorts of drugs, which they have to pay for. I mean, these people have never got any money. So the notion that, they're going to earn more money or do something else, I mean, if they got out of the drugs and they got out of the other sort of problems, in many ways they're going to be better off.
Have you ever met a prostitute who said she enjoyed her work? Another one of the myths.
Yeah, and they've all lied. I've taught all the women I've ever met, working call girls, that I've known and interviewed. I've met a lot of women who've had a lot of bravado and said, yeah, it's great. I'm earning lots of money. I'm enjoying what I do. I've got a boyfriend. He takes me on holiday. I do this. I do that. If you get to know these women, you talk to them, you realise that with most of them, it's a shell. Inside what you've got, 9 times out of 10 are damaged, fragile women who are actually trying their best to make it good. All got histories. And basically, nobody who's got any money, resources, or whatever would ever get into prostitution. All the women who ever get into prostitution, it's always basically when you run out of choices.
Roger Matthews, thank you very much for talking to us this morning.
Thank you very much.
Good luck to you.